My name is Liz Webster, and I'm the founder of Save British Farming. I've been campaigning against Brexit for too long, and I've always been particularly interested in fighting Brexit because of what it means for our food system in particular. And so my focus has always been around that part of the argument. And often we get lost in the weeds of Brexit, mainly because in everyone's mind, Brexit is something different. And we can all get very confused and arguing about how bad it's been for each particular sector, as we are now in post-Brexit, and as we did row about what we anticipated Brexit would do. But I think a good starting point about what Brexit is, it begins with Patrick Minford, and he gave evidence to Parliament 3 years, I think it was, or 4 years before the Brexit vote. And there's that famous clip of Rory Stewart asking him for just-in-time manufacturers, of which farming food obviously is one. And Patrick Minford famously said, well, you have to run it down. So from my perspective, I always understood that putting up trade barriers between us and Europe was absolutely cataclysmic for farming. The history of farming in this country is not as well known as it ought to be, and it is a complicated picture. But we are such a small island with a large population, and we take it for granted that we're always going to have food. And in the European Union, that has only been fostered because food has become more plentiful and more variety, more variety than we've ever enjoyed before since we joined the European Union. So in recent times, people have seen full supermarket shelves, huge variety, and you can get whatever you want at any time of the year, pretty much. I know in the last couple of years, since COVID, there's been, and Brexit has obviously impacted on what we're seeing. But again, it's a drip, drip, drip. And so I'm pretty sure if people had a snapshot of what our shelves were like 6 years ago and what we're seeing now, they probably would be quite shocked because the food supply is being dramatically impacted by Brexit. But ultimately, when we go back to pre-1846 and my favourite topic, the Corn Laws, before that, most of the food in this country was controlled by barons, and they had control of the price of bread. And there was a peasants' revolt, and the Liberals in the Parliament managed to get them to repeal the Corn Laws and import food, which was cheaper than what we had in Britain. And that caused a revolution, and it meant that the poorer people, actually, their wealth increased and they benefited enormously from that reality. And that happened at the same time as the Industrial Revolution, and the empire went from strength to strength, and we became a very wealthy country. But largely, the land itself went to scrub, a lot of it, and it was really a very, very good time for shooting and games and sort of country estates and that sort of thing. And I mean, this is very much a summary here. So if I have got any more knowledgeable history buffs out there, I'm sure you can pick holes in what I'm saying. But ultimately, we got to 2 world wars, and we had very, very low self-sufficiency. I think we were about 30%. And that left us in a very fragile position in 2 world wars because our enemies could target food supplies. And we should remember at this point that we had control of food supplies in the Second World War. In particular, India starved so that we could eat. I've also brushed over the potato famine, but I'm not going to go into the weeds of that now. But food is absolutely essential. We can't live without it. And for me, all of the arguments about, yes, the loss of freedom of movement and all of those other things are painful, a lot of culture. But ultimately, for me, nothing is more important than food. So yes, I have a vested interest because we farm, but this is my husband's farm. He was born here. I come from a family actually of a different background, traveling fairground family, and my grandfather was in the war. He came from a family of master bakers, and he was a cook in the RAF, and he was stationed in India. And so my mind has been programmed by my grandfather and about food after the last war. We were taught to never take food for granted. You weren't allowed to leave anything of an apple apart from the stalk. And so I think I, from a young age, always understood that reality. My family in South Wales, it was heavily bombed. They had a very difficult time during the war. So my views around Brexit took me back to that, as in, ow, why would we go back and weaken ourselves? Because the main reason that we joined the European Union was to do with food security, as we lost control of the empire. And the governments of the time looked at the serious situation and realized that our best interests were in working with the continent next door to us. And here we are, sadly, the other side that wanted the America situation in those days, back in the 50s, were defeated, and we did eventually join the European Union. And my goodness, how have we benefited? Because Britain was in serial decline after the Suez Crisis. And all of that is forgotten by the right wing. Problem with the American trade deal is a race to the bottom in terms of standards. It's a massive food and agricultural lobby, corporations in America. The food system is enormously different to what we have here in Europe. It's done on completely different principles because we have the precautionary principle. And America has been warring with Europe for decades over what's called the hormone wars, because America wants America first, and America wants to dominate the world. And so America tried to get a deal through with the European Union in 2012, I think it was, with TTIP. And of course, the European Union rejected it. Our government, the Conservatives wanted that TTIP, and it's a horror show. And so, in my view, Brexit is about using us as a lever, the Americans, to force the European Union to accept TTIP. And that's really what I'm seeing. And I think the pressure on the single market is greater than ever. I had hoped that with a Labour government, and especially with a pledge to align to EU regulations and wanting a veterinary agreement, I had hoped that that would see us U-turn and go back to closer to the EU. But I mean, I can't say exactly which way we're going to go, but it's looking to me as though the American trade deal is back on the table. That is a very scary prospect for me, and it should be for everybody else, because it means an absolute loss of our post-war pact and values that we all hold dear, and why we identify as pro-Europeans and Remainers, but also proud British people, because we've been able to enjoy those identities within the European Union so seamlessly. So yes, it's farming in the short term since Brexit happened has suffered, and been the COVID damage has masked some of it. But ultimately, who could have predicted that the Conservatives would have sorted out a deal where we had trade barriers to export, but the European Union for 3 years was able to send food and produce over here without reciprocal checks. And that in itself has run down British farming significantly. European food is subsidised. We left the CAP. and the Conservative government set up a new system to run supposedly in parallel with the old system. It's been a mess and hasn't really worked properly. But ultimately, the rug is being pulled from underneath our feet, imports coming in from Europe and further afield, and undercutting our farmers. The supermarkets control the prices. And so for apples and fruit, soft fruit in particular, it's been a disaster. We hardly have any apple growers left in this country now since Brexit. Most of them have grubbed their apples because the cheaper apples were ensuring such a low price that the growers looked at it. They couldn't get the pickers as well because we lost our labour supply, and they looked at it and decided to pack it in. So, for instance, one massive grower I know over in Suffolk, he's turned his farm into a family farm shop and sort of mixed farming, and he's just producing everything now to go through his farm shop when he used to supply all of the supermarkets with apples. And that's why if you go to the supermarket, look at the apple packets, that you will be seeing less and less and less British apples in particular. Then for the soft fruit sector, it's dire. They're on the close to collapse. So for some sectors, they've done better than others. We did do a report before Brexit happened, and some of it we really looked at no deal Brexit. But for the beef and lamb sector, it's not been so bad. The trade deals that we have got are every year the quotas ramp up. So for the meat sector, that is only set to get worse with the Australia and New Zealand deals. So the same thing that's happened to the fruit sector will eventually catch up with the meat sector. Chicken has been quite badly impacted because so much has been coming in from Poland and also a lot from Brazil. So across the board, it's a pretty dire situation for British farming. And I'm sure you've all seen the latest offensive by the Labour government to change the rules around inheritance tax exemption. And it is another significant shock to the sector, which has had significant shocks after shock after shock. And what most people don't understand is the sheer numbers involved in farming. Tractors cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. Your fertilizers, again, tens of thousands of pounds. And in recent times since the Ukraine war, the inflationary rate that we've been paying is somewhere between 44 and 50%. So those costs haven't been passed down to the consumer as yet, because, as I've explained, the supermarkets are hammering down the prices so low. And largely, you're paying for goods at below the cost of production. So in turning the guns on us with this and making out that it's trying to get everybody from escaping inheritance tax from buying land it's a bit like closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. And in fact, many of the millionaires who live in big houses with a few acres are going to be still fine. And the target really is the food producers, because our stock and machinery alone largely adds up to the threshold. And it's the straw that broke the camel's back for farmers. And I know that many Remainers over the years have said to me, why don't farmers kick off? And they're kicking off now, eventually. They didn't really kick off, because the NFU didn't want to get involved in what was, they felt the country voted for it and they had to respect the vote. They felt they had to accept it. So a lot of farmers said that to me, even though they didn't vote Brexit. And so now we are where we are. I have worked with a Labour think tank for the last few years, and I'm very surprised at what they've done. And I can only assume that they've decided to go with what we saw when Dominic Cummings was in Number 10 and the civil service leaked an email to say that Britain doesn't need farmers anymore. And I think it's a very scary prospect to run our farming down, as Patrick Minford asked, and ensure that we end up relying on imported food. Not only that, the other thing that has been happening since Brexit is factory farming is increasing. In the last 5 years, over 200 factory farms have opened up in the UK. A lot of them are in Northern Ireland, and some of you, and you're in Hertfordshire, but there's a big controversy about one over in Norfolk in Liz Truss's former seat. These factory farms are they are Cargill, they're American systems, and they're incredibly bad for the environment. The animal welfare is not great because they're in closed confinement, and it means also importing food to feed animals. It's intensification to the max, and it's the opposite of what the green Brexit they sold in terms of, oh, everything will be lovely and we'll all look after the environment and there'll be wolves and bears and everything will be fantastic with otters and beavers and goodness knows what. And the Labour government have, before the election, they would not commit to a lobby group on against factory farming. Also, there is a group called Feedback, and a non-government association, an environmental group, who are challenging the Australia deal in the court. And because the last government, there was no parliamentary oversight of those deals. Liz Truss and Boris Johnson signed them over, as we know, or I'm sure you've read about, in some drunken evening on the back of a napkin. But the last government signed to the Paris Climate Accord. This is international law. And when they did the Australia deal, there was no impact assessment done on the environmental impact of that deal. And it doesn't take a scientist to work out that the way they farm in Australia is, not the same as us. They generally have big feedlots, which are bad for climate, and then you put the food miles in there as well, and the running down of farming here. We haven't got our animals grazing. You haven't got the carbon sinks in the fields, which we enjoy from having herds eating grass. So of course, it's going to be a disaster, that impact assessment. But Steve Reid came into office, and his first speech in Parliament as Environmental Secretary was, never again will farmers suffer a Tory trade deal again, and they won't be undercut again. And then the first thing he did in office was apply to get the cost capping order removed from Feedback in this challenge to try and derail the challenge of the Tory trade deal. And that is at that point, once I learnt that, I became very concerned about what the Labour government are planning to do by making Brexit work, and their warm talk about going back to the EU, but actually not doing anything about it. So I feel quite negative about where we're headed at the moment, but we'll see how things progress with the farming protests. The public polling shows are largely behind the farmers. I think it's the 22%, and they're more in Common Poll, are in favour of farmers being taxed, in effect putting them out of business. And that's quite small. So it'll be interesting to see how the Labour MPs react. They have 100 Labour MPs in rural seats now, and the pressure is certainly on them. And it seems such a mad thing for a new government to come in and get into such a wrangle and a mess, when they could have scored so many points with the British public and with British business by getting rid of Brexit as quickly as possible. So all in all, it's a bleak picture. I don't know if you've seen the reports from America telling us to do a trade deal with Trump and ditch the socialist European Union. Well, I hope I can come back to you in a few months' time and this hasn't happened, because as far as I'm concerned, this is the reality of Brexit that I feared the most. We felt when the American trade deal under Boris Johnson's tenure, when it was scotched, it was a massive mess in the agricultural sector. And now that it's back in front of us again, I'm very concerned about it for our public health, food security, and for our NHS. And if that does happen, the chances of us getting back into the European Union are pretty slim. Ireland, no doubt, is going to be enormously problematic. And I really don't know what it means for the European Union as well going forward. We've got this continued pressure from Putin, who's now going to be emboldened as well. So it's a very uncertain time. And I wish I had more cheerful news for you. But I hope that in hearing what I've got to say, that you will help educate people out there who are kind of sort of saying, oh, just pay your tax, you farmers, your tax dodgers, because this is not helpful. It's only helpful to ensuring the Brexit disaster that we don't want. So anyway, that is probably all I've got to say. And I'm hoping that you can ask me some interesting questions, and I'll try and get you back with the information that you're looking for.
Right, thanks very much, Liz. That was a very interesting talk. Could everybody unmute and switch their video on if they want to? I shall be clicking around asking you to do that. In the meantime, while we're getting ourselves sorted out, I'll ask the first question. I was really interested by your point about farming as just-in-time manufacture, and that had genuinely never occurred to me before. If you think of just-in-time manufacture as just factories, of course, but so I was very intrigued by that point. Would you mind saying a bit more about the point about TTIP? I must admit that passed me by in 2012.
Yes, I didn't touch on TTIP. Okay. Food and farming, the food and drink sector is our largest manufacturing sector, and farming obviously is part of that. So when Patrick Minford, I think they played a blinder by focusing on the car industry in that discussion, but really it's food, and farming is the sacrificial lamb of Brexit. It's not only farming, it's fishing as well, and we all know that. Because fishing is food, so it is absolutely the sacrificial lamb of Brexit, and for food, it's much harder to get through those checks, the veterinary checks, than car parts. So yes, it is pretty bad. You wanted me to talk to you about TTIP, did you say?
Yes, please.
TTIP is it was the American attempt at getting a trade deal with European Union. I think it was in 2011 or 2012. And
Sorry about that.
And sorry, yes, I can hear someone else talking. And
minute there was an extra person in the room. The physio to nurse, the senior nurse, the registrar, the people in different places.
Richard, you have your audio on.
It's the sense of.
All right, I'll just try and mute him. There we go. That's
okay.
it.
So yeah, they tried to get you've all heard of CETA, Canada took, I think it was 7 years to get a trade deal with the European Union. And that's of course what the Brexit is. kind of got us. They kept saying they wanted the Canada deal, didn't they? Which again, you know, we knew how disastrous that is for agriculture, because the Canada deal for food is not great, particularly for meat, and you know, because of the need for the veterinary checks. So Canada was pretty much underwhelmed by the EU deal, CETA, in that it was the EU that got the best deal. I mean, no surprises here. And Canada didn't really get that much access for their goods. So TTIP was an attempt at America trying to force the European Union to, as they call it, deregulate, but it's really about the precautionary principle. They want us to have their standards, which are, I mean, the standards in Europe are controlled by democracy. And in America, the standards are controlled by the markets. So that is the difference between the two systems, which is why when you make a decision as an elected official to get rid of what is a safety net for you and putting your citizens first, you're not going to do that, because everybody's looking at you as you vote for it, and you're not going to get voted back in again, in theory. So that's how, you know, the European system works. And the Americans want to dominate, and they want us to be like them. And the likes of Koch brothers, who own Cargill, they even donated to the Brexit campaign. They were behind it. The massive agricultural lobby. The IEA, you know, 55 Tufton Street, a lot of that money going into that think tank has come from the USA agricultural industries. So it's big business. And there's a great interview, I must try and dig it out, on BBC Farming Today, I think it was in about 2018, of American livestock farmers. I mean, when we call American farmers, they're not like British farmers. This is big industry. And, you know, they're salivating at the thought of getting access to the European Union because of the number of the population in there. And that's what they want to achieve. It's like, I don't know, it's like wanting to just dominate the world with your produce. So that is what, and the Chinese agree with the Americans as well. And the Russians agree with the Americans, and probably India too, as in they don't like what is a wall of protection, which is based around post-war values, but also historically, we identify in Europe in particular, more so than Britain, because I went through the brief history of food in Britain, we decided to do the repeal of the Corn Laws and let the world feed us. And so we lost connection with food because we ate imported food. In Europe, they didn't, which is why you've got champagne and Parma ham and mozzarella cheese. And the Chinese want to come in and imitate those products and undercut them. It's a war. I mean, wars are about trade generally. They're not generally about people going out and you know, having race riots. It's normally countries warring over trade and money and power. So that's in my view, Brexit is TTIP. Minford wrote the plan for them, and yes, he wrote Thatcher's mining decimation. And how ironic is it that we get a Labour Tony Blair's former advisor saying that the Labour government should do what Thatcher should do to farmers what Thatcher did to the miners. I mean, it's you couldn't make it up. But for years, I have been saying that farming will end up being like the mining industry, which a lot of farmers wouldn't believe. But you know, I've been proved right. I don't like being proved right, to be honest, because I would have preferred to be wrong. But I've been proved right.
Right. Richard, you had an interesting question that you'd like to ask it?
Thank you very much. Liz, well, my question is, DEFRA's farming support policies are more pro-environmental than the CAP, but not framed well to encourage, for example, tree planting in the right places, etc. And of course, there are organizations like the RSPB and the National Trust and so on, which are very pro-environmental. But how can we improve DEFRA's policies while still maintaining best practice in producing good food, which we also need to have?
Well, I've often said that the Elms project is like Boris Johnson's Garden Bridge project. It sounds lovely. It's like a magical story. And I've spoken to a number of people who've been almost hypnotized with, euphoria about, oh, it's going to be amazing. And look, they're not putting any money into it. They're removing money from it. They're putting barriers in all the time. The schemes are only 3 years, which, why are they not for the length of Parliament? And so there's no real commitment to it. It's, I'm afraid it's what I would call greenwashing. And I don't think there's any real intention of delivering what they promise. I just think it plays a nice tune and it disarms opposition to what they're delivering. In the coalition, it was Ed Davey agreed subsidies to North American landowners to chop down trees, to shred them into chips, ship them over here and burn them in Drax power station as supposedly green fuel. It's not green and it's jolly expensive as well. But they're putting, I think it's about $500 million a year we spend on that. And those landowners over there, I can't prove this, but we think that, there's some of them might be British landowners as well, very, very wealthy landowners. And then they're saying, oh, we don't want, we're going to hit the British farmers with inheritance tax. They're actually hitting you, the consumer. It is saying we're not going to do what we did before in having a family farm system where you hand down the knowledge and the land working in a sustainable way, because it was always the case that Britain had the highest farming and food standards in the world and the most sustainable food system in the world. The only thing that has crept in the last 15, maybe 12, 15 years are these chicken factories. Well, it might be 15 years. Under Blair, probably they started to come in. The intensification. And that has been the aggression of the capitalism in the supermarkets. It will continue to go. And Boris Johnson famously said when the pig sector went through the crisis, just as COVID was there, he said, well, we can't allow old-fashioned practices to hold us back. And to me, that directly to me, as in, okay, you want intensification. So now we have more pig factories since that very moment. And that is what will be coming. More beef will come in from the other side of the world and have more intensive food production for chicken and pork. So yeah, the whole, I see the thing around the environment as it's a distraction, because we're already pretty much net zero anyway in this country. And if they really wanted to bring things down, they could have done more on public transport, so we reduce the traffic. But what they did was scapegoat farmers. They even managed to persuade everybody that every single farmer went to the polling booth and voted Brexit. It's been, as I said, the marketing around it has been absolutely brilliant. So, and it's still, even today, I get people saying to me, well, you all voted for Brexit, so you're getting what you deserve. And they still can't understand that if you destroy this food system, it's actually about the consumer. It's sad for the farmers because they farm because they love farming and they love their farms. It's like a Ming vase, the farm. And ultimately, it's very sad for us to lose what is, I feel, is part of our, Britain was made from farming. It wasn't made by God this way. It looks the way it looks because of the way we farmed for thousands of years.